Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Ramona ji, a warm welcome on Ymedia. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you. Thanks for asking. There's lots happening. Once again, we're talking about attacks. The freedom thing that US President Donald Trump is talking about. I want to know, I know there are a host of other issues that you're going to discuss later on. But why don't we start with this at Ymedia Foreign Policy? What is your assessment? What do you think right now regarding what's happening? Who has the upper hand? Because I'm still hearing this claim that Iran is in still a very stronger position. And there are other claims that now US, because of the blockade in the Gulf of Oman, US has a little bit of a stronger position now. So I want your assessment. What do you think and what do you make of it? Please.
Yes, I mean, this is a ever-changing situation. I think the escalation point is, coming to a rise as of yesterday. We know that Iran has already started firing missiles towards the UAE in response to the United States blocking its ports, now going on to a couple of weeks now. Essentially, I think they both amplified it on two different ways. I know the news keeps saying that there's a stalemate in terms of coming to end of war plan, a peace agreement between the two nations, but essentially with President Trump essentially putting the U.S. naval ships against the Iranian port, preventing them from trading, hitting its economy directly, has essentially, preempted Iran to essentially put forward a peace plan towards the president as of last week. The president said he's not happy with it all because, it is a bit reaching for the Iranian side. And I think to get out of the stalemate, Iran has now started targeting UAE that we know has left OPEC, right, as of May 1st. And so this is an escalation point. It could go any way. We know that Pete Hegseth has essentially said that they're still in a ceasefire. So even though we're seeing that the escalation is at sea, it's not on land, and the ceasefire is on land, there is still troubling news coming out of that region. So in terms of who's got the upper hand, I think it might be a tie right now between the two nations, but I don't know how long they can both hold it for. Meaning, if the ports, Iran's ports are still blocked with U.S. vessels, then Iran's being hit significantly daily. And as long as the United States hasn't ended this war, prices when it comes to the gas pumps are through the roof, which affects, cost of living worldwide, and also in the United States. And of course, it is bringing pushback in many ways from countries like China has now said, to ignore the U.S. sanctions that are on Iranian oil because China consumes Iranian oil, one of its biggest customers. So now you're also seeing, pushback from other nations that you wouldn't once see before, with China having such a strong stance now. So, they could be evened out, but I don't know how long they could take in the next little while. If we want to talk about long-term gains and losses, we can go into that as well because it's different for each country.
Yeah, and I'm also listening, I want to hear a little bit more latest what's happening there, but I'm also listening that UAE is preparing for a fresh round of attacks, possibly from Iran. US Secretary of War, earlier it was Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth is mentioning, the ceasefire is not over, despite we're seeing some sort of attacks as well. So what is the latest, what is the current situation? And then I have further questions as well. Please go ahead.
So essentially reports came out yesterday that there was 4 missiles and one hit the Fujairah oil facility in UAE, and the rest have been essentially prevented by UAE, saying that they've been a target. And we have the GCC Council essentially say that they strongly condemn any attacks on any of the GCC countries. We have Qatar that stood up about it, UAE So, they've been very vocal since the ceasefire that took place on April 7th. And then yesterday, there's reports that two ships were hit that were U.S. vessels, according from the Iran side. And then U.S. denied those claims. And then U.S. has come back to say that no, they were private cargo. So there's a lot of mixed information coming out between what's happening exactly between the United States and Iran when it comes to their vessels. But yeah, this means escalation because this was not the case last week. So these are new developments, and without any intervention of the two countries coming to the table, essentially these things could escalate or prolong. And we know that even though Israel and Lebanon are in a ceasefire for a few weeks, the escalations there are still continuing with Israel and Hezbollah for in southern Lebanon. So in name, it's a ceasefire, but there are factors of aggression happening on all fronts, really.
I heard, President Trump as well. He was saying that Iran's navy has been reduced to just small boats, or maybe they have some guns as well. That's all they're reduced. That's what President Trump is claiming, and he's also saying that yes, Iran knows what not to do right now. So, and I also heard the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth as well. So, what do you think when they're talking about Project Freedom? They're saying 15,000 troops are going to involve. What does this Project Freedom mean, and is it even feasible?
Those are all great things, right? We know that this president essentially says a lot of things that, to make sure that the markets react better, earlier in the week. And then we see by the end of the week, things have not gotten better. Essentially, what he's talking about is blocking of the Iranian ports. That's what has been the case for the last few weeks. Right now, he's put a name on it. That's fine. And he did say that he would. Yesterday, he said that he would help escort the ships throughout the Strait of Hormuz. And then further development showed that no, that does not mean, any sort of help in terms of navigating the ships. It's more about giving them information on how to go. We know that Iran has blockaded, the Strait of Hormuz and is asking for an entry point closer to them and less closer to Oman. So we know those things are happening from various reports and from satellite images. CENTCOM did say that they would respond to increasing the troops up to the 15,000 numbers that you're talking about. So this sounds escalatory, but at the same time, it is a stalemate in terms of coming to an agreement. And I don't know how long each side can hold out for when it comes to the United States, when it comes to the prices and affordability in Iran, when it comes to their economy, and also the GCC countries, right? If you can imagine, it's impacted their production and their output. And so they're being, severely hurt as well. And then, of course, when you look at Pacific Asia, they're being, hit by it as well. 40% of Iranian oil goes to China. But we know that Japan, South Korea, rely on oil that comes out of the Strait of Hormuz, 67%, 75%. We know India has been hit. So we can hear about numbers escalating, but at the same time, Pete Hegseth, who's the, head of, these war efforts, is saying that the ceasefire still holds. President Trump still says the ceasefire still holds. And so I think right now the best thing for them all is to have a second round of meetings. To be able to decide what this means for the end of this war. The main thing is that it comes down to Iran agreeing to zero enrichment of uranium, right? Iran's latest numbers I heard came back with 15 years. President Trump is saying, 20 years. At first it was 3 to 5 years. So there's a hard line there in terms of getting rid of the enriched uranium, preventing Iran from enriching uranium, not even for civilian purposes. So that's essentially been it, because the last, couple of weeks, Iran said we'll agree to those, the nuclear program terms if you remove the blockade. President Trump said, no, I will only remove the blockade once you come forward with, agreeing on the nuclear program deal. So that's kind of where things are at right now. We know that, other countries have been in the middle, such as Pakistan and Oman, and even Russia has even said that they would join in the conversations to be able to mediate this thing. So yeah, that's where things are at right now.
Yeah, and you know what? It's not just the concern that we are having there in Iran. Hopefully, things do settle down. That's a wishful thinking, though. Not only between US and Iran, then, we have issues there with Israel and Iran, Israel and Lebanon. There are a lot of civilians who are suffering, in the entire Middle East, but in particularly Iran, Lebanon, many of those areas, Gaza, the sufferings haven't ended there. And I'm sure the Israelis, they're also facing their own massive challenges. So, and now we're hearing the word Cuba. I don't think so, and I want you to elaborate more later on in the show today about the Kuzma review that Canada and US would be doing. Where does Canada stand? It's a very important piece of the puzzle for Canada. If US says fine, Kuzma is up for review, but we won't change much. It maintains status quo. Canada has let go a few of the tariffs here. But then Doug Ford is having his own position, so we'll talk about that as well. But I also wanted to highlight the fault lines always existed in between UAE and Saudi Arabia. But I think with all this, what's happened in Middle East, tensions have escalated a lot between UAE and Saudi Arabia and India and Pakistan. The interesting part is last year at this time, in the first and second week of May, we saw both the nuclear nations. There are only 9 countries on this planet who have a nuclear weapon. For now, that was a point of discussion for Iran. They want to make a nuclear weapon. And many other countries, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, there are many countries who want a nuclear weapon. But there are only 9 countries, including US, Russia, India and Pakistan. They also have nuclear weapons. China also has a nuclear weapons. But 2 nuclear nations going head-to-head war 2025 May. Once again, almost 1 year has passed by. I was reading an article this morning on Washington Post that after almost a year, it's peace so far. Of course, it's peace so far, as the headline said at the Washington Post, but you never know. There are always lots of articles if you read the Pakistani media and the Indian media as well. So both the sides, when I read the articles, they are saying we could see another war, and there are few articles who are also mentioning this time it won't end that soon. India attacked Pakistan, claiming that they were attacking the camps of alleged terrorists over there because there was a terror attack in India in Kashmir Valley, and then India said we're retaliating, we know where they are, and India went inside Pakistan. Earlier they thought the attacks would only go in Kashmir, but then India went inside Pakistan, they started attack. Pakistan responded, and then India also attacked. It was not a full-blown war, but still, you had the Air Force involved. They were attacking each other, if not with nuclear weapons, at least with massive missiles and planes and everything. This could have easily escalated further. This time they're saying it could escalate further. So India, Iran, Pakistan and Afghanistan are already fighting. There is a war between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It stops, there is a ceasefire, then again it starts. Then you have Iran and US, then we have Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Iran. And God knows there could be what would happen between China and Taiwan. And there is North Korea, then Trump has Cuba on its agenda. So much going on. And then you have Russia and Ukraine for February 2022. That war hasn't stopped. So there are lots of tensions across the globe. Aruna, before you start on the questions that I've asked, the Kuzma and so many other things, we've discussed this earlier as well. What is this leadership all about? The leadership is expecting Nobel Prize for Peace. Sure, you can get it. I won't comment on that, whether give them or not. But my simple question is, where is the leadership? We elect our leaders for peace, for prosperity, for service. They'll take care of the citizens. But here we are. Please go ahead.
Yeah, are you referring to leaders such as, all these countries in the United States? Should I start there?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, okay. In the United States, it's a bit of a different situation, right? They elected knowing exactly who Donald Trump is. after his first term, but, it made room for him after the Biden years, right? Americans, were doing worse off. And even a lot of Democrats, they said that they, held their breath and voted for President Trump. And a lot of independents came out and voted for him. And when you compare that with, the state of declining health of, Biden, and then Kamala Harris and her lack thereof of a track record, and essentially President Trump, what he did really well during that election was he was speaking what people cared about, which was, end forever wars, which he's in right now in the Middle East. Another thing that, he campaigned on is making life affordable. He campaigned on ending the war with Russia and Ukraine right away, which hasn't happened. Life being more affordable hasn't happened because of this war in the Middle East with Iran, which has inflation higher than before he was in office. In the United States, it has gas prices through the roof before he was in office. And then he also campaigned on releasing the Epstein files, and that was a little bit of a debacle. So a lot of things that he campaigned on that the Americans wanted to hear in terms of investing back, into the American economy, American infrastructure, all of that were things that he promised on and, essentially didn't deliver. So now a year in, and we have the situation we're in. So, starting from this war that started on February 28th, essentially, we are hearing all these escalations take place. And the fact that this president doesn't have a deal in place so he can have, an end to this war and move on to other more important things is definitely, a huge issue. So we know that these two countries, Iran and US, are openly, trading threats over the Strait of Hormuz. And we know that it's a fragile ceasefire that's taking place right now, and it could collapse anytime. But I don't think either side have an appetite to go into full-on war and want to avoid it. But if they keep things at this point where they don't have an agreement in place, then, I think there would be another fallout for the United States. So, I mean, I'll talk about what China's already pushing back on, which is very significant in terms of the U.S. holding its position on the world, really, like when it comes to petrodollar, with UAE now, as of, May 1st, leaving OPEC, they get to decide essentially how much production and price and output, which is massive for that region, which relies on doing trade and caps it, and trade is all in USD. So, lots of things happening. So right now, with what you suggested on Project Freedom, essentially, it's the U.S. operation under President Trump that they say that they're there to essentially give information to ships to navigate through the Strait of Hormuz. There was a mismatch in terms of what President Trump had put on Truth Social about, helping escort these ships through the Strait of Hormuz. And they said, no. When, media dug in deeper, and they said, no, there's no escorting. Doesn't mean there's going to be more troops deployed to help, private cargo to get through the Strait of Hormuz. Essentially, essentially they're helping, the private ships get through information of how to go through and whatnot, but not essentially escorting. And to that, Iran's response has been that they're warning U.S. on any violation of the ceasefire. And Iran, this is the second day it's been announced that has launched missiles and drones on ships and has regional targets. UAE says that there's reports of missiles and drone attacks from Iran. The key infrastructure that it striked was the Fujairah oil facility, and they had to put that out. There's air defense systems actively intercepting these threats from Iran, and Iran has been warned by all the GCC countries about this. Iran has alternatively actually responded, saying that it denies some of the attacks and disputes the U.S. accounts on some of these things, and is accusing U.S. of violating the ceasefire and escalating with naval operations of its blockade, as well as the Iranian ports. So, this is, it's lots of things happening at once, but really, I think history will tell how this is going. And of course, we're on top of this every day to see what's the latest news coming out of the region. Just to highlight, with the Strait of Hormuz, it's 20% of the global oil supply passes through that region. it's high activity and a very narrow waterway. Right now, the latest stats are about 2,000 vessels and 20,000 crew members on these 2,000 vessels are stranded in this region, essentially not being able to pass through the Strait of Hormuz to get to their location, either to dispatch from the region or coming back to the region. So at least 19 vessel incidents have taken place in terms of attacks during this crisis. And, during normal times before this war started on February 28th, there was about 120 to 150 ships that went through the Strait of Hormuz on a daily basis. And we know that's been cut significantly. The US essentially has said that there's a lot of Iranian boats that have been destroyed, drones intercepted, and that thousands of personnel, the latest claim that they said they would deploy 15,000 to the area. So, aside from calling it a ceasefire, it all points big economies. And so since now China has ordered its companies to ignore American restrictions targeting Chinese oil refineries accused of processing Iranian crude oil. So this is something that the president said that he's, putting on a sanction on Iranian oil. And because China takes 40% of its oil from Iran, China's saying ignore the sanctions, which is very significant because never had we had this situation where China is standing up and, is really saying we're going to ignore it. And what that means for lawmakers, what that means for financial institutions. Essentially, this decision is very significant because when it comes to banks and multinational firms, they're in a difficult situation because they don't know whether to comply with the U.S. sanctions or risk violating Chinese law because China said we're going to ignore these sanctions and we're going to process what we need to do. So now these banks are sitting in the middle thinking, do they follow Beijing or do they face potential penalties from Washington because of the sanctions? So at the center of this is, of course, the dispute is energy and oil. And we know China is an output country that, when it comes to massive outputs supplying, the world with its manufacturing power. So it needs this energy coming out of Iran. And so China remains as one of the largest buyers of Iranian oil. And to that, they're saying this is, this war that started, they're going to still continue doing what they need to do. So this is very significant because, these companies that essentially refine Iranian crude oil are going to continue as they get their orders from Beijing. But this is something that is going to be, we're going to keep watching to see what this means when it comes to sanctions from the US side. And of course, increased penalties that could take place to banks that are still continuing this trade. Essentially, this is a significant time, things that we've never seen before with the United States relationship when it comes to its NATO allies, when it comes to the European Union, when it comes to its relationship with China. We know that President Trump is set to go to China this month for trade talks. It's significant. So we'll see where this situation lands before his trip. And Russia, we know, has been one of the, biggest winners in a sense in this whole entire since this war started, because essentially sanctions were lifted from Russian oil and it's been able to sell in the market. But now there's been new reports that suggest that Russian President Vladimir Putin has significantly increased his security personnel because of growing fears of a coup or an assassination attempt. So this is fresh coming out of Russia. Essentially, we know that Russia and Ukraine have been in a war now going on to 4 years. And even though this war started because Russia believed that it could overtake, Ukraine and do what it needs to do in terms of being able to win the war. And we know that hasn't been the case. Of course, we have, the NATO countries giving lots of aid to Ukraine. And I have updates on the latest figures for Canadian aid to Ukraine. But essentially, when it comes to a report, sources that were cited in the Financial Times said that they're concerned, this concerns came from what would be a rising use of drone warfare. And that included Ukraine's 2025 Operation Spiderweb. essentially, we know that Ukraine even dispatched people to the GCC countries to be able to fight off the Iranian drones. And we know that in this war that's taken place between Russia and Ukraine for the last 4 years, that some of the components of the drones from the Russian side came from Iran. So now, sources are saying that since Russia, under their Operation Spiderweb, that were successful in terms of striking multiple Russian air bases deep inside the country and damaging and destroying dozens of aircrafts, has given signal to the safety of Vladimir Putin. Now, security around Putin has now tightened dramatically, and he's reportedly spending more time in fortified underground locations. Essentially, he's limiting his travel, restricting access to even more, even among close staff. So, because the rumors and the warnings are that not only is the attacks on his life coming from the outside, but also it could come in from inside. And essentially, now they're barring him from using public transportation or unsecured communications, or essentially, restricting his movement. Now, the fears are not only external, they're also internal, because intelligence assessments have suggested that within the Kremlin, essentially, there is internal instability because for a power struggle, right, through the elites. Essentially, this war in Ukraine has really affected his position and standing within the Kremlin, and the heavy casualties and the mounting pressure on the Russian economy, and so it's really affected his leadership in terms of a fight for mobilizing and perhaps changing leaderships. So these concerns have been amplified, and now we saw what happened in Venezuela with Nicolas Maduro. And because of that, of course, they've taken extra steps to essentially protect Vladimir Putin from some of these threats that are growing because of intelligence reports that are taking place. Now, we know that Prime Minister Mark Carney is now home in Canada, but over the weekend and yesterday, he was at the European Summit in Armenia, essentially the first non-European leader to be there from the EU countries to talk about the political situation in the European Union. And at that, he essentially has provided an urgent NATO prioritized defense spending for Ukraine. He announced a new military aid of $270 million. This was announced yesterday for critical military capabilities. And the fund is for Ukraine to purchase weapons and essentially, be able to defend itself in the war efforts. Now, the total Canadian aid for Ukraine has now surpassed $25.8 billion Canadian. That's a very significant amount, with earlier assistance including a $2 billion in military aid, such as drones, helicopters, and missiles. So now this is, in total in 2025, a separate 2.5 billion Canadian dollars was given for economic assistance, and was announced to help unlock IMF and the World Bank funding. Essentially, the funding aims for sustaining Ukraine's defense capabilities during this war that takes place. So that's a big amount. So Canada has launched as a sovereign wealth fund for $25 billion. It's about the same amount that it's given funding to Ukraine since 2021. So that's $25.8 billion Canadian, very significant. And we know that, Canada has been getting closer to its European allies. And this trip that the Prime Minister took was very similar in terms of being able to position Canada closer when it comes to defense, when it comes to trade and ideology. Now, the CUSMA review is just around the corner. July 1st is the date where we're going to have this agreement between Canada, United States, and Mexico take place. And, what is at risk? I mean, if you were to take a look at just the staggering numbers, we're talking about $800 billion annually crosses the Canada-US border. And the dependency is significant on Canada's side. About 70 to 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. So it's one big customer. 90% of its Canadian oil goes to the United States. And so when it comes to the economic integration, when it comes to Canada and US trade. It's 1/3 of Canada's GDP is reliant on this relationship with the United States. So very significant numbers. So now, if we were to look at what this largest bilateral trade relationship in the world is, let's look at the timeline of what took place about these strained relations when Prime Minister Mark Carney is warning us that things may not look so good with the United States. And Canada's biggest weakness is that it relies too heavily on the United States because of its integrated infrastructure, integrated, industries. Well, let's take a look at how did this all start? Why are we here today? Well, if we just go back to 2025, essentially from February 1st to March 4th, essentially there was a trigger event. What was that? That was when President Donald Trump declared emergency tariffs, essentially 25% on most of Canadian goods and 10% on energy exports. And to that, if you recall back then, it was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that essentially stepped up because the framing was around the tariffs, the 25% tariffs, as well as the 10% on energy was situated there because President Trump said, you know what, this is national security. Essentially, because of the Canadian and American it's the largest border. There is immigrants, illegal immigrants crossing the borders. There's fentanyl crossing the borders. And for that, essentially, we want to put the tariffs. So that, at the time, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stepped up. $2 billion went to border security to be able to, say, hey, we've stepped up our security. So there shouldn't be any concerns for illegal immigrants as well as fentanyl crossing the borders. And then to that, essentially, the tariffs were still in place, even though Canada stepped up. And then Canada responded. It retaliated immediately with 25% tariffs on $30 billion on U.S. goods, and then also expanding it to $155 billion within 3 weeks. And at the time, that was under Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So it was, just a retaliation from the Canadian side as a response to the American side. And at the time, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called the U.S. claims false and unjustifiable when it came to the border. And it started what we see today is this full trade war that took place. Essentially, right after the fact, we had the provinces escalate. The provinces, the premiers, chaired by the premiers was Doug Ford, and Premier of Ontario essentially threatened to cut electricity exports to the United States, if you remember that, and restricting critical mineral supply. Those were immediate threats that were put out there, and implemented a 25% surcharge on electricity exports briefly. Didn't go through with it, but then followed through with a liquor ban and trade restrictions. Essentially, this, when it came to the electricity exposure, we're talking about 1.5 million American customers that rely on the grids from Canada when it comes to electricity export. So that's how interdependent we are on each other. And the other provinces followed up with British Columbia and Newfoundland removing U.S. alcohol from its shelves and products, and provinces coordinating what would be economic pressure on Buy Canadian. This Buy Canadian push became huge, where a lot of brands started putting on the Canadian flag to let us know this is a Canadian product and that support Canadian companies and Canadian brands. So this wasn't just a federal response. It became a nationwide response with all the provinces, seeing what they could do within their own jurisdiction. So it was federal, provincial, unified on this economic response. Then you fast forward to March and April of last year, and it came to an escalation phase where then President Trump expanded its tariffs on steel, aluminum, and auto industry. And some tariffs rose to about 50% on metals. When it came to the auto industry, that was devastating because, it was a massive shutdown of some of the auto plants, and because the workers just didn't know if they had jobs. So that was a very significant setback for the auto industry, and then of course steel and aluminum. And so these 25% tariffs on auto and components was announced on March 27th of last year. And because, 50% of the parts get made in Canada and 50% in the US, it came down to, 12.5% tariffs. The Canadian side essentially called it a win, but essentially it was 12.5% tariffs on the auto sector when it came to components, made in Ontario, assembled in Ontario. So this hit Canada very bad in the auto sector, the manufacturing bases, and these are core export sectors for Canada. So that shifted. What did that do? Essentially, it triggered. We had, a new election take place, a new leader took place. New leader of the Liberal Party that immediately became the Prime Minister, which is Mark Carney. Then we went into a general election, essentially, and then Prime Minister Mark Carney came out and said that U.S. is no longer a reliable partner. United States, the relationship is now rupture and not transition. So this is very significant, and huge words for the Prime Minister say this. We know that right after Prime Minister Mark Carney did get elected, he did take a trip to the White House. What looked like a very good meeting in the Oval Office. Essentially, right after that, the talks of Canada becoming a 51st state stopped from President Trump. If you recall, Prime Minister Mark Carney said, I spoke to the owners of Canada and they're not interested in selling. And then he said, certain things are not for sale. And he was saying that, like this White House is not for sale. And so therefore Canada's not for sale. And so all of that talk slowed down and essentially we didn't hear, Governor Carney like we did President Trump say about Governor Trudeau. We didn't hear about the 51st state, but we still had tariffs. And even though the negotiations started, the talks in terms of the talks for the CUSMA negotiations started early, it significantly shifted quite fast. So let's go to summer of 2025. Essentially, this was the negotiation window where talks began quietly. Essentially, there was a drafting of the first steps agreement contours where both sides explored tariff rollbacks, supply chain rules. But the U.S. did demands kept changing. And we know that's, kind of a trademark for President Trump. He shifts his demands. And so just as you think you got him to where, you want to meet him at, things could change very rapidly. Undoing previous talks. And Canada insisted on a rules-based stability. So essentially, something that could be more factual, something that you could actually follow through on. And the trust started getting eroded between both sides, but yet there was still the drafting of this first step agreement that was put into place. And then the breaking point came in October when Ontario, essentially under Premier Ford, launched the Reagan ad, which was about $75 million spent on ads in the United States criticizing the tariffs using Ronald Reagan's voice when he gave a speech about anti-tariff back in his time. And so when President Reagan was against tariffs and talked about how it would impede the economy, this was played with the graphics of the trade relationships between the two countries taking place. And then, of course, you had President Reagan's voice in the background. So to that, there was a massive reaction from President Trump, essentially seeing this as political interference and saying that he's going to terminate all trade negotiations. And this was on October 25th. Of last year, and even though Ontario said that they were going to stop the ads, they let it play, if you recall, and it was during the Super Bowl. So this just essentially ended the relationships in terms of talking about this trade agreement, and it escalated. And essentially, the United States, their representative said that this was, political interference, and that when there's talks taking place, and essentially President Trump said, what the voice of Ronald Reagan, President Reagan was inaccurate, and his speech on being anti-tariff was inaccurate. So what happened? Well, additional tariffs and a lot of public criticism continued. And to that, Canada's response was to, of course, pause the ad campaign, but it also, deteriorated the conversation that was taking place. And at that point, damage was done. So now you fast forward to, towards the end of 2025, and you had the end of it, you had a full breakdown. There was no agreement that was reached on tariffs, supply chains, dispute mechanisms. And to that, of course, there was continued retaliation from the United States side, targeting, Canadian and just the way Trump essentially started talking about Canada again. And to that, of course, there was the political regions in the United States where a lot of the provinces were trying to essentially meet terms with their American counterparts when it came to governors in specific state where there was a lot of trade, to see maybe perhaps on a regional efforts something could be done. But when it came to a nationwide boycott of what it felt like Canadians not traveling to the United States for vacation anymore. Essentially, that's the numbers are significantly down. The snowbirds that would go from Canada to Florida for 6 months, during the winter season, essentially that the numbers dropped from there, and Canada started pivoting towards other partners, such as going to Europe and trying to make sure that its relationship with its European counterparts are right intact, especially NATO, European Union for trade, NATO for meeting its, agreeing on its defense strategy. When it came to the Prime Minister going to India, going to China, going to Australia, Indo-Pacific partners essentially became a big thing. And to that, of course, the U.S., maintained its pressure by saying, hey, if you do a deal with China, Canada and China, then it's going to be a backdoor for Chinese goods to come into the American economy, and highlighted that this is going to be manufacturing, reshoring, and national security is at risk. So this is where things have been. Essentially, the aftermath of the tariffs, essentially there was an internal split within the U.S. House of Votes, essentially 219 against 211 to repeal the tariffs. So that showed that there was a political division within the United States, with Democratic states saying that they are against the tariffs on Canada, and essentially the Republican states really siding with the president because it's not something you do. So now what is at stake here? We're talking about 85% of still flow tariff-free under CUSMA exemptions between the two countries. So if CUSMA agreement is not negotiated the right way, then those 85% of goods that still flow into the United States and back could become tariffed, and that would be a very devastating situation. So what is at scale of these numbers? We're talking about $800 billion in annual trade is at risk. We're talking about, $30 billion Canadian that was in retaliation immediately after the 25 to 50% tariff imposed by the United States. And we're talking about, significantly in terms of the number of products that was targeted at the time was 1,256 products, which would have been, the 30 billion in Canadian immediate retaliation, 155 billion in potential tariffs. And so why I'm raising those numbers is we hope not to go back to those numbers, and we hope that there will be some agreement, because Canada still has its biggest trading partner. 75% of its goods go to the United States. So that is very significant in terms of what is at stake. The $800 billion of trade is at risk between the two countries. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back with more news on what's happening here in Canada.